Hello, everyone. This is lecture 10 on the pharmaceutical industry. So we can't really survey the landscape of health policy in a health economics class and not talk about drugs. Since the beginning of really the 20th century, drugs have occupied an increasingly important place in the health economy. Now, these drugs span the range of vaccines, antibiotics, insulin, chemotherapy, statins, psychotropic drugs, and more. But despite these medical successes, the US pharmaceutical industry has encountered intense media and legislative scrutiny. Pharmaceutical firms are some of the largest and most profitable businesses in the US, and the rapid growth in drug spending has made the pharmaceutical industry an obvious target for policymakers and insurers. Now, also, new and expensive drugs, increasingly marketed through direct-to-consumer advertising, has heightened that criticism. So today, what we're going to do is select several of the most general interest questions to economists. We are going to look at the structure of the pharmaceutical industry, so give an overview of pharmaceutical spending trends and learn how to apply methods of measuring industry competition. In the next module, I'll talk about regulation with the purpose of trying to understand the unique role of research and development in this industry and also its role in pricing. And in the last module, we'll talk about the conduct of the industry. So specifically, how do companies price their drugs? And finally, I'll set you up for our in-class discussion on price regulations. Specifically, should states regulate Sovaldi by implementing a price ceiling for Medicaid patients? So as we did with our labor markets, let's start off by talking about the structure of the market. Now, first and foremost, the pharmaceutical industry is characterized by a rapid increase in spending over time. Get my trusty laser pointer. Here we go. Okay, so this graph is looking at the nominal and inflation-adjusted per capita spending on retail prescription drugs over the last 6 decades. So this light blue line, the lower line, is looking at inflation-adjusted retail price. And what you can see is that on a per capita basis, the inflation-adjusted retail prescription drug spending has increased from about $90 in 1960 to over $1,000 in 2017. Specifically, it's $1,025 if you're interested. So what's driven that growth in spending? This chart is looking at the different spending growth drivers and their contribution to price growth, or I'll say spending growth, that's not accurate, between 2011 and 2017. And what you'll notice is that the recent drug spending is driven largely by the introduction of new brands. So that's this blue bar here over time. You can see that the drug spending is also driven by this pink bar, which is price increases for existing drugs under patent protection, and the purple bar, which represents volume increases for existing drugs under patent protection. You're also seeing fewer patent expiries in these gray bars. And then actually the price of generics has had a downward effect on overall prescription spending, and that's the green bar here. Now, several analyses identify specialty drugs as a primary driver of drug spending. What are specialty drugs? Well, these are the drugs that are used for treatment of conditions that are complex, chronic, rare, that could be certain cancer drugs, Hep C drugs. And what you can see in this chart is that per capita drug spending on specialty drugs really increased between 2012 and 2016. And is that 2015? And it's tapered off a bit in the last few years. Overall, per capita drug spending has been low. It's actually begun to decrease in 2017. Now, this is another way of looking at the difference in prices between brand drugs and generic drugs. And you can see that over the past 5 years, prices for brand drugs have increased on average, while prices for generics have generally decreased. So this is just another way of looking at what I've already told you. There have been some instances of generic drug price increases since 2014. They're not represented in this overall trend, but those drug price increases would be due in part to manufacturer consolidation, so fewer manufacturers producing the generic, and or temporary shortages of the active ingredients that are needed to produce the generic drug. So this is a chart looking at the top drug spending by different drug therapy classes. This is specifically for enrollees in private insurance plans. And what you can see here is that medicines for inflammatory conditions were the most costly therapy class drugs, ranked based on a per member per year spending. So per member per year spending on inflammatory conditions was about $175. This is 2018, followed by $115 per member per year for diabetes medication, and about $80 for oncology drugs. And actually, the per member per year spending on most of these top 5 therapy classes, well, diabetes excluded, is driven primarily by spending on specialty drugs. Now, if you compare what we spend in the US to other OECD countries, you can see that the US spending is, this is 2013 data, so sorry, we're jumping around the decade a bit, but it's nearly double, right? So even in 2013, it was almost $1,000 per capita. Compare that to about $500 per capita on average in the OECD, and far and away more spending than any other country. Now, you can see this trend or this phenomenon pretty clearly in specific drug examples. So this is Humira, which is a pharmaceutical used to treat rheumatoid arthritis. And it's priced at about almost 100% higher in the US than in the UK, and more than 200% higher in the US than in Switzerland. Now, why are we comparing these 3 countries? Well, we know a little bit about the UK system, right? The NHS has more negotiating power on the buyer side. Now, Swiss per capita spending on medicines is among the highest in Europe. Switzerland has a highly regulated and controlled pharmaceutical market. The government agencies in Switzerland decide which drugs are eligible for reimbursement by basic health insurance and at what price they're sold. So this can actually discourage competition. And the Swiss have a combination of what we call external reference pricing and price comparisons of therapeutic alternatives to a given medicine. Now, I'm not sure Switzerland is unique in that regard, but the prices in Switzerland are certainly high. This is another example. This is Xarelto. It's a drug prescribed to prevent or treat blood clots, and it's priced more than twice as high in the US on average than in the UK or Switzerland. This is Truvada, which treats HIV/AIDS, priced about 50% higher in the US compared to Switzerland, and almost double that of the UK. Finally, one more. This is Avastin, and it's prescribed to treat some cancers. It's about 125% higher than in Switzerland, and even more than that than in the UK. This is actually, Avastin's interesting because the price range is relatively large. The 25th percentile of this drug is about $2,200, and the 95th percentile is about $8,800. So really big range of a single drug. Now, why do we see these cross-country price differentials? Well, often the level of competition holds the key to firm and industry behavior. For economists, the degree of market concentration is typically reflected in both the number and the size distribution of the firms within an industry. Now, we've talked about measuring concentration before, and I won't go into all the nitty-gritty again, but just want to highlight again that there are some definite challenges to measuring competition. Some of those can be defining what the meaningful industry is, defining geographic boundaries, and so on. Now, this will give you an idea of the market concentration in the pharmaceutical industry. These were, at least in 2018, the top 10 pharmaceutical companies by market share. So some of these might be familiar to you: Pfizer, Novartis, Johnson & Johnson, GlaxoSmithKline. Now, what you can see is it's certainly not a monopoly situation from the firm level perspective. The market share, highest market share of any of these firms is about 5.6 for Pfizer. Let's talk a little bit more about measuring market concentration. So to do that, economists need to look at meaningful industry groups. Now, a little nerdy information for you. Prior to 1997, the Standard Industrial Classification System, or the SIC, served as kind of the standard of measuring industry groups. But the Department of Commerce has since replaced those SIC codes with what's called the North American Industry Classification System, or the NAICS. And the NAICS codes range from 2 to 6 digits, basically with each successive digit representing a finer degree of classification. Now, the pharmaceutical preparations industry, which is NAICS code 325412, formally it is defined as establishments primarily engaged in manufacturing in vivo diagnostic substances and pharmaceutical preparations, except biological, intended for internal and external consumption in dose forms such as ampoules, how do you say that? Ampoules, tablets, capsules, vials, ointments, powders, solutions, and suspensions. All right. So for any of these 6-digit NAICS codes, we can use either a 4-firm or an 8-firm concentration ratio to look at the share of industry output produced by either the 4 or 8 largest firms. So let's think about the 4-firm concentration ratio for a second. You would basically take the market share, you'd sum them, of the 4 largest firms in an industry, and you'd come up with a number that ranges between 0 and 100%. And typically, we think of an industry with a CR4 ratio greater than 60% as being like tightly oligopolistic, right? 100% CR4 would be a monopoly. 0 would be a perfect competition. And we think of an industry with CR4 less than 40% as reasonably competitive. And what we do is use these concentration ratios for the pharmaceutical industry to gauge competition. So according to the CR4, is the pharmaceutical industry competitive? So let's go back to that chart. And you can see what we do here is, remember, sum the market share of the top 4 firms. So fortunately, these are already sorted for us in terms of market share. So if you take the top 4 firms and you sum them, you get a market share, a CR4, of about 20%. So by this measure, it looks pretty good. I mean, it looks like a fairly competitive market. Now, let's compare the concentration ratio of the pharmaceutical industry to other industries. Let me see if I can get a highlighter here. Here we go. So here's our pharmaceutical preparations industry. And what you can see is, at least this is a different year, the 4-firm concentration ratio in 2002 was 36. You can also look at the 8-firm, which is same thing as 4, just expanded to the top 8 firms. Relatively high number of firms. And you can compare that to, say, the automobile industry. It's really high degree of concentration in the automobile industry. I don't know who that is. Toyota, Ford, General Motors. Tire industry looks fairly concentrated. who makes tires? Michelin, uh, Goodyear, cereal breakfast foods, terrible. Maybe Kellogg's, General Mills, compared to, say, a 4-firm ratio of 11 in the ready mixed concrete industries. That means a highly competitive industry. So by this, definition of concentration ratio, the pharmaceutical industry looks pretty good, but what I hope you're thinking, and what most analysts would argue when they see these numbers, is that these numbers can be especially misleading because drugs in different therapeutic categories are usually not substitutes for one another, right? Concentration ratios for narrow drug classes would be better indicators and would be much higher. Now, why would that be? Well, let me get my pointer back. It's because we see barriers to entry in this market. Now, first and foremost, the highest barrier to entry in the pharma market and with respect to specific drug classes is a government patent. Now, a government patent gives the innovating firm the right to be the sole producer of a drug product for a legal maximum of, I think it's 20 years. What's the economic rationale behind this patent law? Well, patent protection is necessary to protect the economic profits of the innovating firm over some time period. Otherwise, basically, you'd have easy imitation, lower prices, smaller profits, and that would reduce the financial incentive for firms to undertake risky and costly, but socially valuable research and development activities. So the economic rationale underlying the patent system is that even though the patent confers monopoly power on the innovator, the monopoly restriction of output is better than having no product at all. So I'll say that again. The monopoly restriction of output is better than having no product at all. That is, the new drug might not be introduced on the market if not for the patent protection. Some of the drug is better than none. Now, the second type of barrier to entry into the pharmaceutical industry is what we call first mover or brand loyalty advantage. So a drug innovator can usually acquire and maintain what we call a first mover advantage because the quality of a substitute generic product is unknown and requires one to experience to know the quality of the product. Generic drugs can be considered what we call experience goods in that way because consumers normally lack the knowledge they need to judge or experience the drug's quality. Another thing is that physicians have little time or financial incentive to seek out information about the efficacy and risk of new generic products. And also, a bad consumption experience can be particularly harmful in terms of prolonged illness, side effects, malpractice suit, if you switch from a known brand name to an unknown generic drug. So therefore, unless a generic drug offers different and important therapeutic advantages over, or even a very large discount, physicians and consumers, when they're faced with a choice, are reluctant to choose generic over brand name drugs after the patents expire. And finally, control over a key input represents a large barrier to entry here. This could be a specific chemical or an active ingredient, and it can also make it difficult for new firms to enter a drug market. So if new competitors require access to the input, the originating firm may sell it to the new entrants only if it's profitable to do so. And if it's not, and replication is difficult or costly, new firms can find it unprofitable to enter the industry. So in sum, significant barriers to entry exist in the industry. You have legal patents, brand names. These can give entrenched firms an advantage over potential entrants. And theoretically, the advantage translates into market power and the ability to maintain market share despite high prices. So I'll let you pause here at the end of the module and take some time to work through these practice questions.